She was not supposed to be seen. That had always been the arrangement. The invisible girl, the ghost in the corner. The orphan who scrubbed floors until her fingers cracked and bled, who lowered her eyes when spoken to, who made herself as small and silent as possible so that no one would remember she was there. It had kept her alive for years, that smallness, that careful, practiced disappearing. But today, in the great hall of the Ashwood Pack, with its banners hanging limp in the airless heat and its high rafters thick with the smell of burning tallow and old wood, someone was looking at her. Not glancing, not skimming past her the way men's eyes usually did, landing briefly, finding nothing of value, moving on. Looking. Visenya felt it the way you feel a storm before the clouds arrive, a pressure change in the air, a stillness that didn't belong. She was standing to the left of the Luna, 3 steps behind, where she always stood at formal occasions, close enough to be useful, far enough away to be ignored. Her dress was the color of ash, rough spun and worn thin at the elbows, the kind of fabric that announced its wearer's position before she could open her mouth. Her dark hair had been pulled back severely because the Luna preferred it that way. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her eyes aimed at the floor. She did not look up, she did not dare. But she felt it. 2 green eyes like deep forest in the height of summer, steady and unblinking, finding her across the crowded hall as though she were the only still thing in a room full of noise. Her wolf, the part of her she'd learned to keep locked and quiet, stirred in her chest like something waking from a long, uneasy sleep. "Don't look up," she told herself. "Don't you dare look up." She looked up. The Alpha of Helion stood in the center of the hall, and he was the most brutally beautiful thing Visenya had ever seen in her 24 years of a life that had given her very few beautiful things to look at. He was tall, the kind of tall that rearranged a room just by existing in it with a sculptor's face that had no business being so precisely made. Sharp jaw, full mouth, cheekbones that caught the torch light like cut stone. His hair was black and long, pulled back into a man bun that should have softened him but somehow only made him look more dangerous, the way a blade looks more dangerous when it's been cleaned. He wore a fitted warrior's tunic and a fur coat that sat across his broad shoulders like a flag planted on conquered ground. His eyes were green, deeply, impossibly green, and they were locked directly on Visenya. She looked down immediately. Her heart was a fist slamming against the inside of her ribs. "He wasn't looking at you," she told herself. "You imagined it." But even as she stared at the stone floor and forced her breathing to slow, she could still feel those eyes on her like a hand pressed flat against the back of her neck, warm and certain and unmoving. The treaty signing proceeded. Alpha Elliot's voice filled the hall, smooth and practiced and warm, the voice he used for important people, nothing like the voice he used when no one else could hear. Visenya knew both versions intimately. She had spent years learning the difference. She listened without appearing to. She watched without appearing to. These were skills she had developed the way other women developed embroidery or song out of pure survival necessity, practiced until they were second nature. The signing was completed, parchment and ink and the press of 2 seals. Applause moved through the hall like a wave. Alpha Elliot smiled the smile of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted, which, in Visenya's experience, was the most dangerous smile there was. And then he did the thing that would change her life. The thing she had not anticipated. The thing that no one in that hall had anticipated. He turned to Alpha Vector of Helion and spread his arms wide, the gesture of a man performing generosity for an audience. "My pack owes you a great debt for this partnership," Elliot said, his voice ringing through the hall. "Name anything you want from us, anything at all. Consider it yours." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Vector said nothing for a long moment. His gaze moved slowly across the hall, not with urgency, not with the hungry scanning of a man who wanted things, but with the lazy, absolute certainty of a man who already had everything and was merely deciding which new thing to add. His eyes passed over noble women in fine gowns, over horses and land and titles that Elliot had arranged along the edges of the hall as visible offerings. Then those green eyes landed on Visenya and stopped. He studied her with the same steady, unrushed attention he might give a map or a problem worth solving. His thumb came up to his chin, rubbing it slowly, thoughtfully, as if he were working through the logic of something. His gaze moved from the crown of her dark head to the worn hem of her dress and back up again, unhurried, taking inventory of things even Visenya had stopped seeing in herself. She felt every second of it like heat on skin. The change in the hall was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in the quality of the attention, the way a crowd collectively holds its breath when something unexpected is about to happen. Elliot felt it too. Visenya saw his smile falter at the edges. "That," Elliot began, and his voice had lost some of its easy warmth. "That is simply a servant girl, an orphan of the pack. Surely you would prefer something more—" Visenya's head came up. She didn't mean for it to. But the word orphan dropped from his mouth like a stone into still water, hit something in her that she'd spent years burying, and her eyes found Vector's face before she could stop them. He was already looking at her. Something moved in those green eyes when their gaze finally, fully met. Not surprise, not hunger. Something quieter and far more unsettling, the expression of a man who has found the thing he came looking for, though he hadn't known he was looking. He didn't look at Elliot. He didn't look away from her. "I want her," he said. The hall erupted, not in applause. In the particular chaos of people who have just witnessed something that violates the natural order of things, raised voices and frantic whispering, and the sharp intake of breath that goes through a crowd when the ground shifts. Beneath them, noble women turned to each other with wide eyes. Elliot's advisors exchanged horrified looks. The Luna, standing a body's length from Visenya, went so rigid that Visenya could hear the sharp hiss of breath between her teeth. Elliot laughed. The sound of it was wrong, too high, too fast. "Surely you jest, my friend. She is. She has no bloodline worth speaking of. No dowry, no—" Vector turned his head and looked at Elliot for the first time since making his declaration. The laughter stopped as though it had been cut with a blade. Nothing in Vector's expression changed. His face was still, perfectly still, the way deep water is still just before something surfaces from below. But something in the quality of his attention shifted, and every alpha instinct in the room responded to it without a single word being spoken. Men straightened, women went quiet, even Elliot, with all his practiced self-possession, took a half step back. Vector held the silence for 3 seconds. Then he rose from his seat. He did not explain himself. He did not negotiate. He simply stood, and the finality of it moved through the room like a door swinging shut. He walked toward the exit. His warriors moved, 4 of them peeling away from the formation along the wall, their boots striking the stone floor in rhythm as they turned toward the center of the hall, toward Visenya. She watched them come with her heart hammering so loud she was certain the Luna could hear it. Her mind was running through possibilities, escape routes she'd memorized years ago out of habit, contingencies she'd built and rebuilt in the dark of her small room. Every exit from every room in this pack house cataloged and filed in the part of her brain that had never quite stopped expecting the worst. But her feet didn't move, because even now, even with 4 warriors closing the distance between them, she understood at some animal level that what she was leaving was worse than any uncertainty ahead. She knew exactly what waited for her here. She had been living inside it for years. The warriors stopped in front of her. The largest one, broad-shouldered, with a scar bisecting his left brow, looked at her without cruelty. Without anything, really. Just waiting. Visenya straightened. She smoothed the front of her ash-gray dress with both hands, the gesture useless and automatic. She lifted her chin. And then, before she turned to go, she made herself look one final time across the hall. Elliot was standing very still, watching her. His face had composed itself back into the handsome, practiced calm he wore like a second skin. But his eyes were a different story. In them she could see the thing he'd never been willing to hide from her because he'd never thought she was worth hiding it from. Fear, fury, and beneath both, something colder, a calculation. Visenya looked at him for a long moment. She let him see her face, all of it. Every year of silence, every scrubbed floor, every meal she'd gone without, every night she'd cried until there was nothing left to cry, and then gotten up anyway. She let it all sit in her eyes like a sentence waiting to be finished. Then she turned away from him and walked toward the doors. She had been 7 years old the last time she'd felt safe. That was the number she always came back to. 7. The age she'd been when they came for her parents, when the world she'd known, small and warm and smelling of wood smoke and apple cinnamon, had folded in on itself and disappeared. Her father had made the best apple pie she'd ever tasted. She could still conjure it if she tried. The way the kitchen would fill with the smell of it, brown sugar and cinnamon and the particular sweetness of fruit cooked past its rawness into something soft and yielding. He'd make her sit on the counter while he worked, narrating each step in the serious voice he reserved for important things, as though teaching her to bake was as sacred as any ritual. Her mother would come in and steal a piece before it had cooled and burn her fingers and laugh at herself, and her father would look at her mother the way he always looked at her mother, like she was a light source, like the entire room was brighter simply because she was standing in it. Visenya carried those memories the way you carry something fragile, carefully, with both hands, never setting them down. Her mother had been beautiful, pale-skinned and black-haired like Visenya, with the same blue eyes that Visenya had inherited, and that looked in her mother's face like pieces of a winter sky. Her mother had also been kind in a way that had nothing performative about it, not the careful, studied kindness of someone managing their image, but the simple, instinctive kindness of someone who saw other people as real, fully, entirely real. It was the kind of kindness that made enemies in a world of wolves. Alpha Elliot had noticed her mother. Visenya had known this even as a child. In the wordless, intuitive way children absorb the emotional truths that adults think they're hiding. She'd seen the way his eyes followed her mother across a room, the way he found reasons to speak to her, the way his mouth would go slightly hard when her mother turned toward Visenya's father instead, laughing at something he'd said, leaning into him, belonging entirely and publicly to someone who was not Elliot. Her mother had not returned his interest. Her mother had despised him, quietly, with the particular contempt of a woman who sees through a man's performance all the way to what's underneath and finds nothing worth respecting. Visenya had never known exactly what accusation Elliot had manufactured to condemn her parents. She'd been too young, too small, too far from the center of power for anyone to bother explaining it to her. The word traitor had been enough for the pack. It was always enough. A wolf without a pack was nothing. The social logic of their kind made it so, and an alpha's condemnation of a packmate was a verdict that required no trial and permitted no appeal. What she remembered was her mother's face. The last look, tearful but composed, the way her mother had been composed even in the worst moments, not because she wasn't frightened, but because she'd made a choice, in the final seconds available to her, to give Visenya something other than terror to remember. She'd smiled. It had been the most heartbreaking thing Visenya had ever seen, and it had also been the bravest, and sometimes in the dark of her little room, she pressed her face into the rough pillow and wept for that smile until she couldn't breathe. She had grown up inside that grief, learned to fold it small and carry it quietly, the way you carry a wound you can't afford to have anyone notice. The pack had tolerated her the way you tolerate something you've agreed to keep but never wanted. The Alpha's charity case, they'd called her in the early years, before charity curdled into contempt. She was given the smallest room, the heaviest work, the coldest food. She was passed over for festivals and celebrations and the small, accumulating kindnesses that make a life feel livable. When the current Luna had arrived blonde and sharp-eyed and carrying her beauty like a weapon, the toleration had calcified into something more purposeful. The Luna had chosen Visenya as her personal maid within a week of arriving. At the time, Visenya had thought, in her careful, analytical way, that this was a deliberate choice, that the Luna was the kind of woman who recognized threat in places other women didn't think to look, and that something in Visenya's silence had registered as dangerous. She'd been right, though she hadn't known then exactly what the threat was. What the Luna saw, Visenya would come to understand, was that her husband's eyes sometimes traveled in Visenya's direction. Elliot's gaze was not the gaze of a man who'd loved her mother. It was the gaze of a man who took what he wanted and had decided, at some point, that Visenya was something he hadn't yet taken. It made her skin crawl in a way she'd learned to function through, the way you learn to function through chronic pain, acknowledging it, working around it, never letting it show on your face. She had survived the Luna's cruelty with the same practiced endurance. The too cold water, the floors that were never clean enough, the meals withheld for imagined infractions, the particular grinding humiliation of being made to feel like an imposition on the air you were breathing. Visenya took all of it and filed it away in the part of her that kept records, the part that was always watching, always noting, always adding figures in a long column that hadn't yet reached its sum. She learned other things, too. That was perhaps the one gift her impossible situation had given her. Proximity to information that women of higher standing never heard because no one thought about what the servant in the corner might be absorbing. Men talk when they think no one is listening. They talk freely and carelessly and with remarkable specificity, and Visenya had become extraordinarily good at the art of scrubbing a tunic slowly. She'd linger over the washboard, hands moving in the steady rhythm of work, her ears open and her expression blank, and the men would talk around her the way water talks around a stone, not because they trusted her, but because they'd forgotten she was capable of listening. She'd learned about pack politics and territorial disputes and the shifting alliances of the northern packs. She'd learned which alphas were negotiating secretly and which were buying loyalty they hadn't been offered. She'd stored it all away with the same careful thoroughness she applied to everything because knowledge was the one resource no one could confiscate from her, the one thing she could accumulate without permission. She had been in this state watchful, self-contained, existing in the careful margins of other people's lives when the incident in Elliot's chambers occurred. He'd summoned her on a pretense so thin it was almost an insult to her intelligence, a room she'd already cleaned. She'd known it the moment she stepped inside and saw the floor gleaming, the surfaces undisturbed. She'd known, and her stomach had dropped, and she'd made herself stay very still and very calm because panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. He'd circled toward her with the particular, unhurried confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His hand had reached for her, and Visenya had stepped back without deciding to. Something in him had flickered annoyance, the sharp edge of a man unaccustomed to resistance. He'd reached again, and then her wolf had moved. She hadn't called her forward. She hadn't even thought about it. But her wolf, quiet for so long, kept so carefully leashed, rose up through her like a wave through deep water, and the sound that came from Visenya's throat was not a sound she'd ever made before. Low, resonant, unmistakably a growl, the kind that came from something older and larger than the woman standing in the room. Elliot had gone very still. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite fear, but the shadow fear makes when a man recognizes something he's underestimated. He'd covered it quickly, smoothed his expression back into the practiced calm. "Get out," he'd said. She'd gotten out and walked the whole length of the corridor with her heart hammering against her ribs and her wolf prowling in tight circles beneath her skin, both of them understanding that something had shifted. That whatever thin tolerance had kept her in this pack had just developed a crack. That evening, scrubbing the men's hall in the low burning aftermath of the encounter, she'd heard the conversation that changed the shape of things. The Helion pack was coming. The name had traveled from mouth to mouth among the men with a particular quality to it, the way people say the name of something they respect enough to be careful around. Helion, the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories. Its alpha, a man whose name was spoken with that specific combination of awe and wariness that Visenya had come to recognize as the truest measure of power, not the manufactured reverence that Elliot engineered for himself, but the involuntary deference of men who'd evaluated the threat and found it real. She'd wondered, scrubbing the stone floor in long, even strokes, what lies Elliot had told to bring such a pack to his table. What he'd manufactured, what he'd omitted, what shape of falsehood he'd constructed and dressed in enough truth to make it convincing. She'd thought about it with the detached, analytical interest she brought to most things, not out of loyalty to anyone, simply because understanding the architecture of deception was useful, and she'd always been drawn to the useful. She hadn't had time to finish the thought. A younger maid had appeared at the door, breathless. "The Luna is asking for you." Visenya had set down the brush. She'd dried her hands on her apron. She'd gone. She'd known before she arrived what kind of summons it was. There was a particular quality to the Luna's silences before she performed cruelty, a quality that the house absorbed and transmitted the way stone absorbs cold. The air in the Luna's chambers had that quality now, thick and overwarmed by the fire that burned even in mild weather, the room heavy with the scent of rose oil and something underneath it, bitter and controlled. The slap came before Visenya had fully crossed the threshold. Not as hard as it could have been. The Luna had learned over years that she didn't need to hit hard to make the point. It was the precision of it that mattered. The particular, deliberate quality of a woman reminding another woman of the exact dimensions of her position. Visenya stood very still. Her cheek burned. She kept her eyes at the middle distance, focused on nothing. "Trying to seduce my mate," the Luna said. Her voice was almost pleasant. "In his own chambers. You shameless little—" Visenya said nothing. This, too, was a skill, the art of receiving accusation without expression, without the flinch that invited escalation. She'd been practicing it for 17 years. She was very good at it. She felt the tears building somewhere behind her eyes and forced them down. Not here. Not where they could be seen and enjoyed. Later. Later she would cry. In the dark, alone, where it was hers. The Luna dismissed her. She walked back to her room without hurrying. She closed the door behind her and sat on the narrow edge of her cot and pressed both hands against her face and breathed. And in the dark, in the small and private space that no one had ever bothered to take from her because no one had ever understood that it existed, she let herself remember. Apple pie and wood smoke, her mother's laugh, her father's hands, large and flour-dusted, lifting her onto the counter. The three of them at the table in the golden light of an evening that had not yet become a before. Her mother's last smile, tearful and brave and utterly her own. She cried until her chest felt like something had broken loose inside it and rattled with every breath. She cried for her parents and for the 7-year-old she'd been who hadn't understood yet what was happening. She cried for all the years that had happened since. She cried until there was nothing left. Then she cleaned her face, squared her shoulders, made herself think about tomorrow. Because tomorrow was the day of the treaty signing. Tomorrow the Helion pack was coming. And Visenya, who had survived 17 years in this house by paying attention to things no one thought she was paying attention to, had the particular, skin-prickling feeling that tomorrow was going to matter. She hadn't known how right she was. Now she walked toward the great hall doors with 4 Helion warriors flanking her and the chaos of the hall rising behind her like water behind a closing dam. She did not run. She did not look back. She kept her spine straight and her chin level and her face composed into the expression she'd perfected over nearly 2 decades, the carefully constructed calm of a woman who had decided that whatever came next could not be worse than what she was leaving. She almost believed it. Almost, because then she heard it behind her, cutting through the noise of the hall with the clarity of a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Elliot's voice, stripped now of its warmth, stripped of its performance, down to the cold core of the man underneath. "She is nothing," he said. "She is cursed stock. When you find out what she really is, you will bring her back." The words hit her between the shoulder blades like a thrown stone. She didn't let them slow her. Ahead of her, standing in the open doorway with the pale afternoon light at his back, Vector had turned, just slightly, just enough that she could see the edge of his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the dark fall of his hair as he waited without waiting, in the particular way of a man for whom waiting had never really been necessary. He did not respond to Elliot. He did not so much as glance in his direction. He looked at Visenya, and he simply waited for her to reach him. And Visenya, who had spent her entire life being left, being overlooked, being the one the room forgot, walked toward the first person who had ever crossed one and decided she was worth the crossing. She didn't know yet what it meant. She didn't know what she was walking into, what waited for her in Helion, what this strange and silent man wanted from a girl the world had decided was worth nothing. She didn't know yet that he'd been looking for her for a very long time. She didn't know, not yet, that she'd met him before. No one spoke to her on the journey. That was the first thing she noticed. Not cruelty. The silence wasn't the pointed kind. It was simply the silence of people who had been given a task and were completing it, who did not consider small talk a part of that task. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the forest change. Ashwood's trees were old and close-grown, their branches lacing overhead into a canopy so dense that the light came through broken and thin, the kind of light that made everything look like it was underwater. But as the carriage moved north and the trees began to change, growing taller, more widely spaced, the undergrowth giving way to long stretches of open forest floor, carpeted in dark moss and fallen needles, she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not hope. She was too careful for hope. Something quieter, an opening perhaps, the feeling of a window that had been painted shut for years being eased upward a fraction, just enough to let in a thin thread of outside air. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched the world change, and did not let herself think too far ahead. They traveled through the night. At some point, exhaustion overtook her anxiety, and she slept not deeply, not safely, but the light and watchful sleep of someone whose body has simply run out of the fuel that fear requires. She woke to gray dawn light and a landscape that had shifted entirely while she wasn't looking. The trees here were massive, ancient things, their trunks wider than 3 men standing arm to arm, their roots rising from the earth in great gnarled arches. Mist sat low between them, pale as smoke. The air, when it found its way through the carriage's gaps, smelled of pine resin and cold water, and something deeper underneath rich, dark earth, the smell of a place that had been growing things for a very long time. Then the trees broke open, and Helion spread itself before her like something out of a story she hadn't believed in for a very long time. It was large. That was her first thought, and it was an inadequate thought, but it was the one her mind reached for first, because the scale of it simply exceeded her reference points. The pack grounds stretched across a natural valley between 2 ridges of old stone, the buildings rising in warm gray and amber tones, well-built and solid, the kind of architecture that speaks of a people who intend to stay. The great house at the center was enormous, not the ostentatious enormity of Eliot's Hall, which was large the way a man puffs out his chest, all deliberate display, but the quiet enormity of a structure that was simply built to hold what it needed to hold, with no excess and no apology. Torches burned along the roads and paths even in the early morning, and the grounds were already alive with movement workers, warriors running drills in the far field, children cutting across an open square, a woman hanging laundry in a doorway who looked up at the passing carriage with open curiosity rather than suspicion. Warmth. That was the word she kept returning to, which surprised her, because nothing about what she'd heard of Helion had suggested warmth. The warriors had not been warm. The silence on the journey had not been warm, and the Alpha, cold and still and certain as winter stone, was perhaps the least warm person she'd ever stood in a room with. And yet, the pack itself breathed warmth the way old bread breathes warmth. Something well-made and long-tended, something that had been cared for over generations until the caring had become part of its structure. Strange, she thought. Strange and real, and nothing like what I expected. The carriage stopped in a courtyard of smooth flagstone. The door opened. A woman was waiting, older, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that has settled into its final expression and made peace with it. She looked at Visenya with the frank appraisal of someone who has assessed many people and has no patience for the performance of not doing so. "You'll be hungry," the woman said. "Not a question. Come." Visenya came. She was given a room. Not a cell, not a servant's cupboard, not the kind of room that communicates its occupant's disposability in every detail. An actual room, on an upper floor, with a window that overlooked the courtyard, and a bed wide enough that she could sleep in the center of it and not feel either edge. There was a writing desk. There were shelves, empty but present. There was a fireplace, small but functional, already lit. The floors were covered with a thick wool rug in deep red and amber, and after 17 years of cold stone beneath her bare feet in the mornings, the softness of it when she stepped from the bed that first evening was so unexpected that she stood on it for a full minute, just feeling it, before she could make herself move on. She cried that first night. Quietly, as she always did, her face turned into the pillow. But these were different tears from the ones she'd wept in Ashwood, not the grinding, exhausted grief of someone enduring, but something more complicated, more confused. The tears of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact is itself disorienting. She didn't know what to do with a room that was simply hers. She didn't know what to do with a bed that was simply comfortable. She didn't know how to be in a place where no one had yet required anything of her, and the not knowing frightened her in a way that all the years of cruelty somehow hadn't. She cleaned her face. She got up. She went to the window and looked out at the night-quiet courtyard, and she made herself breathe. 2 weeks passed. They were the strangest 2 weeks of her life, and her life had contained a great many strange things. On the third day, a guard had appeared at her door, not the broad-shouldered woman, but a young man with an open face and the careful neutrality of someone who'd been given specific instructions about how to behave and escorted her, without explanation, to the Pack's library. She'd stood in the doorway for a moment that felt longer than it was. The library was the most beautiful room she'd ever been in. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall, filled with more books than she'd known existed in one place. Long reading tables of dark wood. Tall windows that let in the clean northern light and pooled it on the floors in long golden rectangles. The smell of it, old paper and leather binding, and the particular dry warmth of a room that is regularly lived in and loved, hit her somewhere behind her sternum and settled there like an ache. The guard left. Visenya walked to the nearest shelf and ran her fingers along the spines. She read for 6 hours without stopping. She came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time, the guard would appear at her door after breakfast, escort her to the library, and leave her there until she indicated she was ready to return to her room. She asked no questions about it. She'd learned long ago that asking questions drew attention, and drawn attention was the precursor to consequences. She simply went where she was taken and used what she was given and observed everything she could with the same quiet thoroughness she'd brought to 17 years of surviving. She noticed things. The way the warriors moved through the Pack grounds, efficient and purposeful, but not the brittle, performative discipline of Ashwood, where men had been taught with the effort of projecting strength because their alpha required it. Here, the discipline was settled, internal. These were people who were competent because competence was simply what they were, not because they were afraid of what would happen if they weren't. She noticed the older woman, whose name she learned was Marin, appearing every other afternoon with a chair and a cup of something hot and a topic. She would sit across from Visenya and begin to talk, and the things she talked about were not small things. Pack governance, territorial law, the history of the Northern alliances and the ways they'd shifted over the last 3 generations, trade routes and their political implications, the relationship between Pack hierarchy and individual wolf autonomy, and where the line between the two could be drawn without breaking either. Heavy things, complex things, things that required the kind of sustained attention most people reserved for matters that concerned them directly. Marin talked about them with the confident ease of a woman who'd spent decades thinking carefully about them, and she watched Visenya with those frank, appraising eyes as she talked. And Visenya understood not all at once, but gradually, one session at a time, that this was not casual conversation. This was instruction, deliberate, structured, and aimed at something she couldn't yet see clearly. She sat in her room on the 14th evening and looked at the wall and thought about it. Why? The question sat in the center of her chest like a stone. She'd carried it for 2 weeks, and it had not gotten lighter. Why her? Why any of this? What does he want? She was still turning it over when the knock came at her door that evening. She'd already changed for bed a dainty red nightdress, the finest fabric she'd ever worn against her skin, one of several things that had appeared in her wardrobe without explanation on her second day. She stared at the door for a moment, her heart picking up its pace, then crossed the room and opened it. The guard on the other side had the expression of a man delivering something routine. "The Alpha requests your presence in his study, my lady." My lady. She'd been called that by every person in this pack from the moment of her arrival, and every time it landed on her with the same small, disorienting shock. Not cruelly, not sarcastically, simply as a form of address, ordinary and unloaded, the way you call water wet. She did not change her clothes. She followed the guard through corridors that were quieter at this hour, the torch shadows long against the stone walls, the great house breathing the slow breath of a place settling into night. Her bare feet were silent on the rugs. Her heart was not silent at all. They stopped before a door on the upper floor heavier than the others. Dark wood with iron fittings, a thin line of amber light visible beneath it. The guard knocked twice, then stepped back. "Go in, my lady," she breathed once. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was dim and warm. Shelves on 3 walls, a desk to the left buried under maps and documents, and the comfortable chaos of a space that was genuinely worked in, not arranged to project the image of work. A low fire in the hearth threw amber light that moved rather than settled, giving the room a quality of contained, breathing warmth. It smelled of wood smoke and ink and something else underneath, something clean and cold and faintly resinous, like the forest outside, like the air before rain, like him. Vector was seated behind the desk. He was not reading, not working. He was simply sitting, his long body at rest in the chair, one elbow on the armrest, and he was looking at the door. Looking at her, the moment she appeared in it, as if he'd been waiting not impatiently but simply the way a man waits who has already decided that the waiting is worth it. In the 2 weeks since her arrival, she had not seen him. Not once. She'd caught his scent sometimes in the corridor near the library, in the particular quality of the air in the great hall during meals she'd eaten in her room, but he himself had not been present in any space she'd occupied, and she'd told herself that was fine, that was manageable, that she didn't need to understand any of it yet. Now he was 6 feet away across a desk, and the composure she'd been cultivating for 2 weeks felt considerably thinner than it had 20 minutes ago. He was beautiful in the way that had struck her in the hall. That quality of a face so precisely made it became its own category of thing. The man bun was gone. His black hair fell loose around his jaw and shoulders, slightly disordered, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He'd removed his outer layers. He wore a simple, dark tunic, unlaced at the collar, his forearms visible where he'd pushed back the sleeves, and the sight of him undone in even this small way was somehow more imposing than the full warrior regalia of the hall. His green eyes moved over her the way they had in the hall, unhurried, specific, taking inventory without appearing to. She crossed the room and stood before his desk and said nothing. She'd learned that silence, properly deployed, was not a vacuum, it was a surface, and what people chose to put on it told you everything. He said nothing either. For a long moment, the only sounds were the fire and the distant night outside the window. His eyes held hers with a steadiness that should have felt like a challenge but somehow didn't. It felt like the stillness before something is said that cannot be unsaid. Visenya had not survived 17 years by waiting for other people to determine the shape of things. "What do you want from me?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. She was grateful for that. Vector looked at her for another moment. Then, in a single fluid movement, he rose from his chair and walked around the desk. Not toward her, he stopped at the front edge of it and sat on the corner, facing her, close enough now that she had to recalibrate the space between them. He was taller than she'd registered in the hall. His eyes, at this distance, were the kind of green that shifts between registers deep forest in certain light, something brighter and more volatile in others. He said nothing immediately. She held her ground. "I need an advisor," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying the natural authority of someone who'd never needed to raise it. "Women are meticulous, detail-oriented in ways men in this business routinely are not. I need someone meticulous." Visenya stared at him. Of all the answers she'd built and discarded over 2 weeks of speculation, this one had not been among them. She'd considered captive, leverage, a message to Elliot, some complicated political currency she hadn't yet understood the denomination of. She had not considered this. She thought about the library, about Marin, about the books on governance and territorial law that had been waiting at eye level. Of course, that was what the 2 weeks had been. Preparation, or the beginning of it. The realization settled through her like cold water, clarifying everything it touched. She stepped closer to him. Not much, 2 steps, enough to change the geometry of the conversation. Drop the reason, she said. The real one. Why me specifically? Something moved in his face. Not quite surprise, he didn't look like a man who was surprised easily. He stood from the desk edge, fully upright. He was close enough now that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze. And something in her wolf, quiet for years, carefully leashed, stirred at the nearness of him the way it had stirred in the hall. Not with fear, with something more complicated and considerably more inconvenient. She held her ground. She had not come this far and survived this much to be moved by proximity. Vector looked down at her. His expression was still that still, unreadable thing, but his eyes were not still at all. They moved over her face with an attention so specific she felt it like a physical sensation, like being read in a language she hadn't known she was written in. Then, slowly, he raised his right hand, and with a gentleness so unexpected it stopped her breath entirely, he traced the line of her face, cheekbone, jaw, the high arch of her cheekbone with the backs of his fingers, barely touching. The way you touch something you aren't sure is real. His thumb found her lower lip, rested there for one single, devastating second. Visenya forgot to breathe. Then he looked at her, not at her face in general, but into her eyes specifically, with something she had no category for, something that was bittersweet and certain and very, very old. And he said, in a voice that had lost every last trace of that practiced distance, "Because you made me pinky promise you to come back." The words fell into the room and didn't echo. They simply landed and stayed, taking up space, changing the air. Visenya stared at him. He smiled then, small and bittersweet. Visenya took a step back. "You," the word left her on a breath. Her hand came up and she pointed at him, a gesture so unplanned, so far outside the careful composure she maintained at all times, that she almost didn't recognize herself doing it. "You," she said, and the world folded. She was 7 years old. She was wearing her hair in 2 tight pigtails that her mother had braided that morning, and she was sitting alone at the edge of the feast ground with a piece of gingerbread in both hands, eating it with the serious, methodical attention she gave to things she was enjoying. The feast was one of those seasonal gatherings where several packs shared a territory for a night, something that happened rarely enough to feel significant. There were torches everywhere, and the smell of roasted meat, and someone playing a stringed instrument badly but enthusiastically somewhere near the east fire. The adults moved in clusters, talking and drinking, their voices woven together into a sound she found comforting without understanding why. She'd been given gingerbread, her mother's gingerbread, warm and dense with spice, the best thing she'd ever eaten, and had retreated from the noise to eat it in peace. A shadow fell across her. She looked up. A boy stood in front of her. He was perhaps 10 or 11, tall for his age in the way boys sometimes are, with a head of curly brown hair and the most severe frown she'd ever seen on a child's face, as if he'd been issued the frown along with his height and hadn't yet figured out what to do with either. His eyes were green, deeply, precisely, impossibly green, and they looked at her with the open suspicion of a person who has learned to be cautious about approaching things that seem good. She looked at him for a moment, then she held out the gingerbread. He stared at it. He stared at her. He looked at the gingerbread again with the expression of a boy evaluating a possible trap, then sat down heavily beside her and took a piece, and ate it with his frown intact, as if refusing to admit that it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. They sat in silence for a long time. It was a comfortable silence, the silence of 2 children who have each independently decided that sitting quietly next to someone is better than sitting quietly alone. When the bonfire was lit and the dancing began, he stood up. He looked at the fire and then he looked at her and said, with the bluntness of someone who'd not yet learned to wrap things, "Dance with me." She scrunched her nose. "No." "Why not?" "Because you'll fling me around. You're too big." He looked at his own hands as if considering this accusation seriously. Then, without a word, he did something that made her breath catch even at 7 years old, even without the vocabulary to explain why. He knelt, right there on the grass in front of her, one knee down, and he held out his hand open, palm up, the gesture so formal and deliberate it was absurd coming from a 10-year-old boy, and yet somehow wasn't absurd at all. His green eyes were serious. His frown had softened into something more earnest. "Dance with me, my lady?" She'd rolled her eyes. She'd felt her face go warm in a way she couldn't account for. She'd given him her hand. They danced badly and with great enthusiasm, turning too fast around the bonfire, their laughter dissolving into the general noise of the night. He hadn't flung her around. He'd been careful, in the deliberate, self-conscious way of a boy trying very hard not to do the thing he'd been accused of, and she'd found this so charming that she'd laughed more than she'd laughed in months. Deep into the night, someone called his name from across the firelight. A sharp voice, an adult voice, the kind that meant it was time. He'd turned to go. She'd grabbed his sleeve without thinking. "Will you come back?" she asked. "To another feast?" He'd turned. In the firelight, his green eyes were very bright and very young and very certain, the way only a child's eyes can be certain, before the world teaches them the cost of certainty. He'd held out his smallest finger. "I promise," he'd said. She'd hooked her pinky around his. She'd felt the warmth of his hand, the solidness of it, and had stored it somewhere she didn't know she was storing things. Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd and the firelight and the noise, and she'd stood at the edge of the bonfire with her hair falling loose from its pigtails and her chest full of something warm and undefined, and she hadn't known his name. She had never learned his name. 3 weeks after that feast, her parents were killed, and the warmth of that night had been buried under so many layers of grief and survival and necessary forgetting that it had ceased to feel like a real memory at all, more like something she'd dreamed once, a fragment of a life that hadn't had the chance to become one. The memory dissolved. She was standing in a study in Helion, and she was 24 years old. And the boy with the green eyes and the serious frown was standing in front of her, wearing a man's face and a man's authority, and the same green eyes, unchanged. 17 years older and carrying them the same way, steady, direct, seeing. Her hand was still pointing at him. She became aware of this distantly, the way you become aware of something at the edge of your vision. Vector was watching her with that small, bittersweet smile. Not performing it, just wearing it, the way you wear something you've carried long enough that you've stopped noticing the weight. His eyes were soft in a way she hadn't seen them be before. Soft the way something gets when it's been wanted for long enough that the wanting has gone past urgency into something more fundamental, more patient. Visenya lowered her hand. She pressed it flat against her sternum, against the place where her heart was doing something loud and structurally questionable. He remembered. 17 years. He remembered a little girl with pigtails eating gingerbread at the edge of a feast fire. He remembered a pinky promise made in the dark. He remembered, and he came back. The words would not come. For the first time in her adult life, Visenya was speechless. Just the enormous, pressing weight of the thing settling over her, too large to speak around. Vector watched her process it. He didn't rush her, didn't try to fill the silence. He simply waited with that patient, ancient certainty, the way he'd waited at the door of the hall that afternoon, as if waiting for her, specifically, was something he'd had practice at. After a long moment, he straightened. "Go back to your room," he said. "Your work begins tomorrow." He sat. He picked up the nearest document and looked at it in the way of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and now intends to return to everything else. She turned and walked to the door. She pulled it open and stepped into the corridor. She heard the door close behind her with a soft, final click. She walked in silence, and the silence was entirely different from the one she'd walked in for 17 years. She stepped into her room. The fire had been banked low while she was gone, glowing amber in the hearth. The bed was turned down. The rug was soft beneath her feet. She sat on the edge of the bed in the red nightdress and stared at nothing for a very long time. And then, very quietly, Visenya did something she hadn't done in years. She smiled. It was a small smile, uncertain, unpracticed, the expression of a face that had nearly forgotten how. But it was real, and it was hers, and no one was watching, and so she let it stay. Outside her window, Helion breathed its slow, warm, ancient breath, and for the first time since she was 7 years old, Visenya did not brace herself for what tomorrow would take from her. She simply waited for it to come. She was not good at it in the beginning. The first morning she sat in on a council session, she said nothing. Not because she had nothing to observe, but because the shape of the room was new, the dynamics between the men unfamiliar, and she'd learned early that the most expensive mistakes were the ones made before you'd finished understanding the terrain. After the session, when the council had filed out and she was still sitting with her hands folded and her thoughts very loud, Vector came and stood at the edge of the table. "Nothing?" he said. 17 things, she said. "I'm deciding which ones are worth your time." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted at the corners of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the ghost of an expression that hadn't quite committed to itself yet. "Tell me all 17, he said. "I'll decide which ones are worth my time." She told him all 17. He listened to every one without interrupting, his arms folded across his chest, his green eyes on her face, and when she'd finished, he was quiet for a moment before he said, 15 of those are worth my time. "Which 2 aren't?" he told her. She thought about it and disagreed with one of them and said so, and he considered her reasoning with the specific, focused attention of someone who is genuinely evaluating an argument rather than performing the evaluation of it. And then he said she was right, and the session became a discussion, and the discussion ran for 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, Visenya realized that she'd forgotten to be careful. She'd just been thinking, out loud, without architecture around it, without the measured, careful scaffolding she normally built between what she thought and what she said, and it hadn't destroyed anything. The walls were still standing. No one had used it against her. She walked back to her room that evening and sat at the writing desk and stared at the wall, and felt, underneath the fatigue of real intellectual work for the first time in her life, something she'd stopped expecting to find. She felt useful, genuinely, specifically, purposefully useful. Not useful the way a scrub brush is useful. Useful the way a key is useful, because there is a particular lock, and she is the particular shape that opens it. The work found its rhythm over the following weeks. She sat with Vector through council sessions 2 or 3 mornings a week, and afterward they would evaluate sometimes in the council chamber, sometimes in his study, once memorably in the corridor outside, because he'd had a thought midway through walking somewhere else and simply stopped. He would lay out what had been said, and she would lay out what she'd heard underneath it, which were often different things, and the conversation that followed was unlike any she'd had in her life, not because it was gentle, it frequently wasn't. They disagreed with a regularity that surprised her and a frankness that surprised her more, but because it was real. He wanted to know what she actually thought, and he'd made that clear in the way he responded when she gave it, and she'd slowly, carefully begun to believe it. Not everyone was pleased with her presence. She'd expected that. She was female, she was an outsider, she was young, she had no bloodline that anyone recognized, and no title that anyone respected. The council members who were unhappy about her showed it in the ways men show things when they can't show them directly. The particular quality of their silences when she spoke. The way certain questions were addressed to Vector across the table rather than to her, when she had clearly been the one who'd raised the relevant point. The conversations that stopped slightly too abruptly when she entered a room. She catalogued all of it and said nothing. Not to Vector, not to Marin, not to anyone. Because Vector, as it turned out, was one of the most quietly terrifying rulers she'd ever observed, and he required no assistance in managing his court. When one of the senior advisors had made the mistake, in her 3rd week, of speaking over her in a session not rudely, just with the comfortable confidence of a man who has never been required to check that impulse, the quality of Vector's stillness had shifted in a way that moved through the room like a cold front. He had not said anything immediately. He had simply waited until the advisor had finished, and then looked at Visenya and said, "Finish your point. 2 words. No raised voice. No explicit reprimand." The advisor had not spoken over her again. She made friends, slowly and in the careful way of someone who has learned that friendship is a vulnerability and must be extended only to people who have demonstrated they won't use it as such. A young warrior named Devon who guarded the library door 3 mornings a week and had strong opinions about territorial law that he expressed at volume when he thought no one was listening. A kitchen woman named Sira who slipped extra bread onto her tray every morning with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who feeds people the way other people breathe automatically, without requiring gratitude. Marin, who was not warm in the conventional sense, but who was consistent, which Visenya had learned was worth considerably more. She asked Marin one afternoon about Vector's mate. It had been weighing on her. She'd noticed the absence of it, no Luna in Helion, no woman at the center of the pack's domestic life, no name mentioned in the casual conversational way that mates are mentioned when they exist and are present. She'd noticed and filed it, and told herself it was simply information, relevant to understanding the pack's political structure, nothing more than that. Marin set down her cup and looked at Visenya with the frank, evaluating gaze that was her default expression for everything. "He hasn't found her," Marin said simply. "His mate. He's been waiting." Visenya nodded, the way she nodded when she was absorbing something and wasn't ready to respond to it yet. "For how long?" she asked. "A long time," Marin said, and looked at her in a way that felt like it meant something specific, and then picked up her cup again. Visenya walked back to the library after that session and sat at a reading table and stared at the open book in front of her for a full 15 minutes without reading a single word. Her wolf turned slow circles inside her chest, unsettled and warm and impossible to explain. "Stop it," she told herself. "Stop that immediately." She turned the page and read, or attempted to. That night, she'd been in his chambers past the usual hour, working through a trade agreement. Vector appeared in the doorway. He'd clearly been elsewhere, his hair was down and slightly disordered, his tunic unlaced at the collar further than usual, his sleeves pushed back to the elbows in a way that did things to the room's atmosphere that Visenya chose not to examine too closely. His eyes went from her face to the document, then back to her face. Something in his face shifted that shadow of a smile thing, the expression that wasn't quite there until it was. He stepped into the room, looked at the document. "You've been here since the 8th bell," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly counted the hours. "The agreement has problems. How many have you found?" 6. A pause. She watched him absorb this, the way he absorbed things she said that surprised him not with visible surprise, but with a quality of stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, marginally more present. "I'll have it sent to the drafters in the morning," he said. "Go to bed. I want to finish the annotations first. You can finish them in the morning. I'll forget the precise phrasing by morning." "You won't forget," he said. "You never forget anything." She opened her mouth to object. He stepped toward her, and before she'd processed what was happening, he had bent, and she was uplifted from the floor and in his arms. She went rigid. "Put me down," she said. Her voice came out considerably less commanding than she'd intended. "You've been sitting for 6 hours," he said, in the tone of a man stating a self-evident fact. "You'll cramp walking back if I don't." This was almost certainly not true. She was 24 years old and had spent most of those years doing physical labor that would have laid most people flat. Her legs were fine. She did not say this. She said nothing, in fact. She could feel the warmth of him through her dress, could feel the steadiness of his heartbeat where her shoulder pressed against his chest, could smell him that clean, cold, musky scent that she'd started associating with safety in a way that alarmed her every time she noticed it. He carried her through the corridor in silence. A servant they passed had the presence of mind to look at the middle distance as though the alpha routinely carried his advisor to her chambers at the 12th bell. He set her down at her door with the same unhurried care with which he'd picked her up, and stepped back and looked at her with that green gaze. "Sleep," he said. "Good night," she said, which was not the same as agreeing. He turned and walked back down the corridor without another word, and she stood at her door and watched him go, and pressed the back of her hand to her cheek and found it warm. "This is a problem," she told herself. "You are developing a problem." She went inside. She did not finish the annotations. She lay on the bed in the dark with her arms folded over her chest, and her wolf turning slow, contented circles inside her, and told herself that both of them needed to stop. Neither of them stopped. She slept off that night with a cheeky smile and a light heart. The library at night was different from the library during the day. Visenya had started going there in the evenings about 6 weeks into her time at Helion, After the council sessions were done and dinner had been eaten and the part of the day that was required of her had ended, she'd take a candle and a book and sit at the long table by the window that looked out over the moonlit courtyard, and she'd read until her eyes grew heavy. She was 3 hours into a history of the Northern Pack alliances when she heard the study door open behind her and the particular quality of footsteps she'd learned to identify as his unhurried, the step of a man entirely comfortable occupying whatever space he was in. She did not look up. He came to the table and set something down a glass, half-full dark liquid, and pulled out the chair across from her and sat. She could feel him looking at her over the open pages of her book. She let him. After a moment, he said, with the slightly rough quality his voice had in the late evenings when the day had worn the edge off it. "You're always in here. You're always finding me in here," she said, still reading. "Those are different things." A pause. Then a sound she'd come to recognize, the low, barely there exhale through the nose that was, for Vector, the equivalent of a laugh. She looked up. He was watching her over the rim of his glass with the green eyes that she'd stopped being able to look at for long periods without her pulse doing something funny. He'd been drinking quietly. She could see the slight loosening at the edges of him, the way the controlled stillness had softened a fraction at the joints, the way his free hand was resting open on the table rather than curled, the way a man's hands rest when he's genuinely at ease. It struck her that she'd never seen him at ease before. Composed, yes. Controlled, yes. Patient in the way of someone who has chosen patience as a discipline. But not at ease. Not this. She found it disarming in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Ask me something," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You've been not asking me something for 3 days," he said. "I can tell. You get a particular look." "I don't have a particular look." "You do. You go very still and your chin comes up slightly, like you're measuring the cost of the question against the value of the answer." She stared at him. The accuracy of it was deeply inconvenient. "Do you miss your parents?" she asked. The ease in him shifted, not closing exactly, but deepening. Something going inward the way a flame goes inward when there's a draft. He was quiet for a long moment. She waited, the way she'd learned to wait with him without filling the space, without making the silence a thing to be escaped. "My father," he said finally. "Every day. My mother died when I was young enough that what I miss is the idea of her more than the actual person. I wasn't old enough to know her the way you need to know someone to miss them properly." He paused. "Yours?" "Every day," she said. "The same way you miss yours. I was old enough to know them, old enough that the knowing is what hurts." He looked at her across the table and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was the kind that builds something rather than the kind that erodes it. Then he stood and said goodnight, and she watched him go, and when she turned back to her book, she found she'd lost her page and didn't care at all. The months accumulated the way months do when you're actually living, rather than simply enduring, not in the sharp individual increments of before, but in the way water fills a vessel, steadily and without drama, until one day you look and the vessel is full, and you can't quite account for the moment it happened. The flirting started small, so small she almost missed it. A comment about the color she was wearing delivered in the same measured tone he used for everything, so she'd almost taken it as simple observation before she registered the specific quality of his attention when he said it. The way he'd hand her documents across a table sometimes, his fingers deliberately not moving from the page until she'd looked up at him, until their eyes had met. And then he'd release it with that shadow of a smile and go back to whatever he'd been doing. The way he'd started standing closer than was strictly necessary during sessions, not inappropriate, never inappropriate, but close enough that the warmth of him registered, that the scent of him found her, that her wolf did that slow, inconvenient turning thing in her chest. She retaliated in the only ways available to her, with precision. A response so dry and well-timed that he'd stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked at her with genuine delight, which was rarer and more precious than she was prepared to admit. The deliberate, perfectly judged deployment of his own name rather than his title, in a moment when the formality of the title would have given her an advantage, and she chose to give it up because the way he reacted to his own name in her mouth was a form of information she found worth gathering. The evening she'd looked up from a book and caught him watching her with an expression she had no word for, yet something open and quiet and unguarded. The expression of a man off duty from himself, and held his gaze for 3 deliberate seconds before returning calmly to her page. Her skin was pale enough that every flush showed, and he had noticed this, and she suspected he was exploiting it deliberately. She had not been teased before, not playfully, not by someone who wanted her to win half the time. She discovered, to her own surprise, that she was exceptional at it. The invitation to run came on an evening when the light was doing something extraordinary. He appeared in the library doorway, and she felt him before she saw him, that now familiar shift in the room's quality when his presence entered it. "Run with me," he said. She looked up. He was dressed differently than usual, lighter, simpler, the kind of clothing that was meant to come off quickly. She considered the invitation. Her wolf, who had been increasingly difficult to reason with over the past several weeks, offered a response so immediate and unambiguous that Visenya nearly laughed. "Now?" she said. "Now," he said. She closed her book. The forest at dusk was a different country from the forest in daylight. The shadows were longer and more complex, the sounds fuller, insects beginning their evening work, the distant call of something earthy. They stopped at the edge of the tree line. He gestured toward a large tree to his right and stepped to one on his left, and she understood. She stepped behind her tree and undressed quickly, folding her light blue dress over a branch with the practical efficiency of someone who's done this, the mechanics of it, at least enough times in private. Her wolf rose to meet her before she'd finished the thought, and the shift moved through her the way it always did, not painlessly, but cleanly, the brief, sharp reorganization of being replaced by the extraordinary expansion of sensation that came on the other side. She stepped out. He was already there, and she stopped. She'd known, intellectually, that he would be large in wolf form. She felt her wolf go very still inside her, and then very warm. He stepped toward her, his wolf large and black as midnight, and slowly nudged her shoulder with his enormous snout, a gesture so gentle from something so large that it undid something in her chest. She felt her tail move before she decided to move it, a wag, helpless and involuntary. The wolf's vocabulary for something the human side of her was still refusing to say directly. Then he ran. And something in her, the part that had been still for so long, the part that had been keeping itself quiet and useful and carefully contained, broke loose and ran after him. The forest opened up around them, and they moved through it the way wolves move when they're not hunting, not patrolling, not performing any function at all, purely for the animal joy of movement, of speed, of the ground rising to meet you and the air parting for you, and the whole body in agreement about what it wants. She was fast. She'd always known she was fast. In the abstract way, she knew things about her wolf that she'd never had occasion to test properly. But running beside him or ahead of him, in the moments she pushed, she discovered the specific pleasure of being fast with someone who was also fast, who wouldn't simply let her win and who wouldn't condescend to lose. He caught her. She turned, and they tumbled into the undergrowth in a tangle of legs and surprise. And she came up shaking leaves from her coat and found him standing 3 feet away with his ears at the angle that meant satisfaction. And she launched herself at him before he'd registered that she was going to. And he went down, and she stood on his back for exactly 1 second before he twisted and she was rolling through the moss again, laughing, her wolf laughing, which was a sound she hadn't known she could make. They ran until the light was gone and the moon had taken over, laying its silver across the forest floor in long, fractured panels between the trees. Then he slowed, and she slowed with him, and they walked side by side through the quieter part of the wood, their breathing settling, the heat of exertion fading to a warm, bone-deep satisfaction. The clearing opened before them without warning, a break in the trees that revealed a pond, still and dark and perfectly reflective, the moon sitting whole in the center of it like a coin dropped from a great height. Grass grew to the edge of the water, long and soft, and the air here was different, cooler and more still, carrying the smell of clean water and night-blooming things. They drank. The water was very cold and tasted of stone and depth. Then they separated to their trees, and she changed back and pulled on her dress and stepped out into the clearing to find him already there. His hair loose around his jaw, sitting at the water's edge with his boots off and his feet not quite reaching the surface, looking at the moon in the water with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Peaceful. That was the word. Simply, purely, unguardedly peaceful. She sat beside him. The grass was soft and slightly damp, and she didn't care at all. She dipped her own feet to the ankle and hissed at the cold, and heard him exhale the almost laugh, and they sat in the particular comfortable silence that had become the ground note of what they were to each other. The silence they settled into not because they had nothing to say, but because the saying could wait and the being here couldn't. She became aware of him watching her, not with the covert attention he sometimes deployed, the sideways observation he thought she hadn't catalogued. Directly, openly, the way a person looks when they've decided to stop pretending they aren't looking. She turned and met his gaze. The moon was in the water and in his eyes, and the light it made was the kind that shows you the true shape of things rather than the managed version. "You're beautiful," he said, simply. Without preamble or qualification, the way he said all things he meant, as fact, as observation, as something that requires no decoration because it is already exactly what it is. Visenya looked at him. She looked at the long black hair that fell loose around his face and made him look less like a ruler and more like what he actually was, which was a man sitting barefoot by a pond in the moonlight. Her breath caught. He moved slowly, with the deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered, his big hands coming up to cup her face the way she'd felt him do once before, in a study that felt like another world now, except this time there was no distance in it, no bittersweet restraint, just his hands warm against her jaw and his eyes on hers, and the question in them that he didn't ask aloud because they'd both been answering it for months. He kissed her. Softly at first, the first press of it barely there, a question given in the only form he apparently trusted himself to give it in this moment, gentle and certain and asking. And then she answered, and the answer was not soft at all, and his hands shifted in her hair, and she felt the exhale leave him like something he'd been holding for a long time finally released, and the kiss deepened into something that was not a beginning, nor an end. He lifted her. Her hands found his shoulders, and he stood from the grass with her in his arms, and the world tilted gently, and he laid her in the clearing, and the grass was soft beneath her, and the moon was overhead, and his mouth found her throat, and she arched upward, and the rain came, not gently, not the polite preliminary of a light drizzle building toward something. It came the way northern rain comes, all at once, in full commitment. Oh, cold and absolute and completely indifferent to the timing of anything happening beneath it. Visenya gasped. Vector pulled back and looked up at the sky with an expression she'd never seen on his face, which was something very close to pure, uncomplicated indignation. She burst out laughing. It came out of her before she could stop it. Not the quiet, careful smile she'd allowed herself in private, not the small, controlled thing she'd been practicing, but a real laugh, full and helpless and loud in the rain-soaked clearing. She laughed until she was shaking with it, her hair plastered to her face, completely soaked through, looking up at a sky that was pouring down on them with absolute enthusiasm. Vector looked down at her. The indignation had dissolved. He was watching her laugh with an expression that was so unguarded, so wholly unmanaged, that she felt it like a hand pressed flat to her sternum. Then he started laughing too. They ran back through the rain in their human forms, still laughing, stumbling over roots they couldn't see in the dark, the water coming down in sheets around them, the forest alive with the sound of it. She grabbed his arm at one point when she lost her footing, and he caught her without breaking stride, and they ran the rest of the way like that, her hand in the crook of his arm, his pace adjusted to hers, the rain between them and all around them, and entirely unable to touch what had just happened in the clearing. They arrived back at Helion soaked through and breathless and still quietly, privately laughing, and parted ways at the corridor junction without words. Because words, at that particular moment, we were simply not the instrument the moment required. She changed into dry clothes and sat on the edge of her bed and ran her fingers through her wet hair and felt the warmth of him still in her hands and didn't try to tell herself to stop. The mating ceremony was not something Visenya had thought much about. She'd been aware of its approach the way you're aware of a season changing, in the quality of the light, in the quality of the pack's energy, in the way conversations shifted when she entered rooms, and the preparations that had begun appearing in the great hall and the grounds. Helion took the ceremony seriously, which made sense. It was the deepest ritual of their kind. The moment when the bond that had been moving beneath everything, invisible and patient and certain, rose to the surface and declared itself in front of the pack that would witness it. She stood in the great hall on the morning of the ceremony in a dress that Sarah had pressed into her hands the night before, deep green, the color of forest in full summer, the color of his eyes, and watched the hall fill with people and tried to feel whatever she was supposed to feel. Anticipation, perhaps. Nervousness. What she felt was a low, constant warmth, like a fire that's been banked carefully and has been burning steadily for long enough that it doesn't require tending anymore. Then it changed. It was not gradual. It was not the slow intensification she'd been half expecting, the careful, linear progression of a feeling growing larger. It arrived all at once, without preamble, the way the rain had arrived in the clearing, total and absolute and indifferent to her preparedness for it. The mating pull. She'd read about it. She'd heard it described by women who'd experienced it, in the fragments of conversation she'd collected over years of careful listening. None of the descriptions had been adequate. They couldn't be adequate, she understood now, for the same reason that no description of the sea is adequate to the person standing at the edge of it for the first time, feeling it in their feet. It was a hook behind the sternum, gentle and absolute, oriented with the precision of a compass needle finding north. And north was across the hall. North was Vector. He was already looking at her. He was standing at the far end of the hall in the dark, fitted clothing he wore for formal occasions. His hair down because she'd once told him offhandedly that she preferred it, and his green eyes were on her face with an expression she'd never seen on him in public before. All that carefully maintained composure gone, just gone, like a wall taken down in a single motion, and what was underneath it was so nakedly certain, so entirely without ambiguity, that Visenya felt it from across the room like a hand extended. He had known. She understood that now, in the way you understand something that has been true for longer than you've had the language for it. He had known from the hall in Ashwood. Perhaps before. He had come for her because the bond had been pulling him toward her across whatever distance, across however many years, with the same relentless patience of a thing that is certain it will be answered eventually. He had simply been waiting for her to feel it too. The hall fell away. The voices fell away. The ceremony and the crowd and the other pairs finding each other and the gasps and the cries that were beginning to fill the space. All of it fell away, and there was only the pull, and the man at the end of it, and the 17 years between them that had not managed to break the thing that was pulling them together. She walked toward him. He walked toward her. They met in the center of the hall in front of the entire pack, and the gasps that went through the crowd were different from the earlier ones. Not the surprise of strangers finding each other, but the recognition of a pack watching something that had been coming for a long time finally arrive. People stepped back. The space around them cleared as naturally as water clears around a stone. Vector looked down at her. Up close, with the ceremony lighting and the crowd and the weight of it all pressing in from every side, his face was the most honest she'd ever seen it, every careful layer stripped away, nothing between him and what he was feeling, and what he was feeling was enormous and old, and entirely hers. "Mine," he said. The word left him on a low, rough exhale. The claim and the relief of it tangled together, the sound of a man setting down something he'd carried for a very long time. Then he pulled her in and kissed her in front of his entire pack, and it was nothing like the moonlit clearing by the pond. That had been discovery. This was declaration. This was the thing made real in front of witnesses, staked into the ground, the permanent and witnessed and irreversible. Around them, the mating ceremony continued. People cried. People found each other. Someone nearby made a sound of pure joy. The hall was full of the extraordinary chaos of 100 private miracles happening simultaneously. Visenya had her hands in his coat and her forehead pressed to his jaw and was breathing him in. The wood smoke and cold forest and ink smell of him. The smell she'd been storing in her body for months without permission. The smell that her wolf had been cataloging since the very first moment in that crowded hall. And underneath everything else, underneath the noise and the feeling and the enormity of what had just changed, one thought surfaced and stayed. He kept his promise. He had come back. Across 17 years, and whatever distance and every impossible thing in between, he had come back. And he had found her. And he had waited with the patient, unbreakable certainty of someone who had never once stopped believing that the waiting would be worth it. She tightened her hold on his coat. Outside, the world continued its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to what had just been sealed inside the great hall of Helion. The forest stood in its ancient, patient silence. The pond caught the light. The clearing where the rain had found them sat quiet and still and waiting. And Visenya, who had been unclaimed and unwanted and invisible for so long that she'd stopped expecting to be any other way, held onto her mate and let herself be found. The messenger from Ashwood arrived on a gray morning 12 days after the ceremony, during a council session that had been running long. He was young, barely more than a boy, with the travel-worn look of someone who'd ridden hard and hadn't slept. And he delivered his message with the slightly wooden formality of someone repeating words he'd been made to memorize precisely. Alpha Elliot was gravely ill. He wished to see them both, the Alpha of Helion and his new mate, before his condition worsened further. He sent his regards and his hope that they would honor the Pack Alliance by answering his summons. The council chamber was very quiet when the boy finished. Vector looked at the messenger with the unreadable expression he wore for things he was evaluating carefully. Then he said, without looking at Visenya, "We'll come after the mating ceremony period has concluded. Tell your Alpha we have obligations to our pack that cannot be moved. 2 weeks." The messenger bowed. He left. The council session continued. Visenya sat in her usual chair with her hands folded on the table and her face unreadable. Vector looked at her. She felt it. He was watching her with those green eyes that saw more than she'd ever intended to show anyone. She held his gaze steadily for some time and gave him a small smile. And in the privacy of her own chest, so far beneath the surface that nothing could have found it, she felt the cold, quiet satisfaction of a calculation nearing its end. If he saw something in her face, he didn't name it. They arrived at Ashwood on a moonless night, which was not an accident. Visenya had not chosen the timing explicitly. She'd simply known, in the way she'd always known things she couldn't have articulated the logic of, that arriving after dark was correct. That there was something right about coming back to this place under cover of night. Something fitting about returning to the house that had kept her invisible by giving it the darkness it deserved. The rooms they were given were fine. Better than fine. The best guest quarters the Ashwood pack house had, because Elliot, even sick, even dying, understood the grammar of status, and the Alpha of Helion and his mated queen demanded a particular grammar. The room was large and warm, with a fire already burning and a bed that was almost obscenely well appointed compared to what Visenya had occupied for 17 years beneath the same roof. She stood in the center of it and breathed in the smell of Ashwood, old stone and pine resin, and the specific compound of wood polish and cooking and something underneath it all that her wolf recognized immediately, the territorial scent of the pack she'd grown up in, and waited to feel something. But she felt nothing. "The maid will bring food," she told the young woman who'd shown them up, her voice carrying the measured authority she'd spent months learning from a man who wore it as naturally as breathing. "We'll hold audience with Alpha Elliot and the Luna in the morning only. Tonight we're not receiving anyone." The maid bobbed her head and left. Visenya turned from the door and found Vector intensely watching her from across the room. She looked back at him and summoned the small, private smile she'd been discovering she had. The one that was specifically for him, that lived in a different place than all the managed expressions she'd spent years building. "You're exhausted," she said. "The ride was long." "I'm not," he said, which was nearly true. He tired less easily than anyone she'd ever known. But he came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed when she sat, and his hands found her shoulders, and he worked the knots out of them with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything that mattered. And she let her head fall forward and breathed through the specific combination of tension releasing and grief surfacing that made her throat ache. Later, he lay in the dark behind her, one arm around her waist, his breathing slowing toward sleep. She felt the moment he crossed the boundary. The subtle shift in the weight of his arm, the deepening of his breath, the way the room changed quality when another person in it is no longer awake. She lay still for a long time. Then she moved. She did it slowly, the way you do something when you're trying not to disturb what you're moving away from, easing his arm from her waist with both hands, inch by inch, watching his face for any change in the rhythm of his sleep. He didn't stir. She stood from the bed and crossed the room on bare feet and lifted the cloak she'd laid over the chair earlier and paused at the door. She looked back at him. He was lying on his side now, facing where she'd been, one hand resting open on the pillow beside him in the unconscious reaching of sleep. And the sight of it did something to her chest that she pressed her hand against and breathed through. She crossed the room and touched his hair, so gently, barely contact the way you touch something you can't afford to wake, and pressed her lips to his forehead. She felt him exhale in his sleep, slow and deep, his body doing the thing bodies do when they register something right, even unconscious. She straightened. She went to the door and slipped out and pulled it closed behind her with a silence she'd perfected over a lifetime of moving through spaces where she wasn't supposed to be. The graves were at the edge of the eastern wood. She'd known they would be. She'd spent years knowing exactly where they were and never once going, because going would have required explaining her absence, and explaining her absence would have required acknowledging the graves existed to people who had put them there without remorse. So she'd carried the location the way she'd carried everything about her parents, inside, private, precisely remembered, waiting. She found them without hesitation in the dark. The markers were simple. 2 stones, not large, not engraved with the kind of words the dead deserved. Just stones, placed by someone who'd done it with the minimum necessary to call it done. The ground around them was overgrown. No one had tended them. No one had come here. Of course no one had come here. She knelt. The ground was cold and damp through the fabric of her dress, and the trees were very close, and overhead the stars were doing their patient, indifferent thing, and she knelt between the 2 stones and put her hands flat in the earth between them, and breathed. She hadn't planned what she would say. She'd spent 17 years with the conversation building in the back of her mind, adding to it, revising it, expanding it. But standing in front of it now, she found that none of the prepared things were what came out of her. What came out was simply the truth, in the quiet, plain voice she used when no one was watching and she didn't need to perform anything. "I'm mated," she said, quiet as breathing. "His name is Vector. He's difficult to explain. He's very good. I need you to know he's very good." The trees made their small sounds around her. The wind moved through the upper branches and came down to her as a sigh. "Dad," she said, and the word broke in her mouth the way a word can break when it hasn't been spoken aloud in 17 years, when it's been kept in the throat so long it's forgotten how to survive the open air. "I made apple pie last month. Sarah in the kitchen helped me remember the spices. It wasn't as good as yours. It wasn't close. She pressed her lips together. She breathed. "Mama," she said. Softer. The way you say a word when you're afraid of what saying it will open. "I thought about your smile, the last one. I've thought about it nearly every day for 17 years. I want you to know that it worked. What you were trying to do with it. You wanted me to remember something other than the worst of it, and it worked. I remember you laughing in the kitchen. I remember the way you looked at Dad. I remember being held." Her voice failed on the last word. She let it fail. There was no one here to see it. The tears came the way they always came when she was truly alone with this, not the controlled, private grief she permitted herself in the dark of her room, but the older, deeper version underneath it, the one that had been 7 years old when it first broke open and had never entirely healed since. She cried until the shaking stopped, until the grief had gone through her completely and left behind the particular emptied-out stillness that comes after real crying. Not relief exactly, not peace, but honesty. The honesty of a body that has finally said the true size of the thing it's been carrying. She sat back on her heels and wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the 2 stones. "I took care of it," she said. Quietly. Matter of fact, the way you report something completed. "Elliot, I want you to know, I'm not asking you to be proud of it. I know what it is. I know what it makes me, and I've made my peace with that. I needed you to know that it wasn't nothing. What he did. It wasn't nothing, and it wasn't without consequence. He didn't get to walk away clean." The wind moved through the trees again. She sat with it. "I'm going home after this," she said. And the word home sat in her mouth like something new, like something she was trying the weight of and finding it held. "Hellion. I'm going home to Helion. With my mate, I have friends there. I have work that matters. I have—" She pressed her thumb to the mark on her wrist. "I have someone who kept a promise he made to a little girl he'd met once. I need you to know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she felt it. Not a sound. She would have heard a sound. Not a visible presence. Her back was to the wood. A scent, and then a warmth, and then familiar hands, large and certain and unmistakable, settling on her shoulders from behind, and the weight of him lowering to the ground beside her, and his arm coming around her the way it did in sleep, the same unconscious sureness. Except he was fully awake now, fully present, and he said absolutely nothing. He simply held her. She turned into him. She hadn't planned to. Her body simply moved the way a body moves toward the thing it recognizes as safe, the way water finds low ground without decision, without calculation. She pressed her face into the space between his jaw and his shoulder and felt his arms close around her, and she cried again, but differently this time. Not the grief-alone crying of the last hour. Something else. The crying that happens when the grief is real and the person holding you is also real, when you don't have to manage either the grief or the witnesses to it. He didn't try to stop the crying, didn't try to end it or fix it or reframe it into something more manageable. He held her, and he was warm and steady and entirely present, and he let her grieve at the full size of it, which was the most profound gift anyone had ever given her. Luna Claire was already in the hall when they arrived. She was sitting at the head of the long table in the posture of a woman who has decided that the best way to receive people she is afraid of is to pretend she isn't receiving them at all. Spine straight, hands folded, her blonde hair pinned perfectly. She was still beautiful. Whatever else could be said about Claire, the beauty had not gone anywhere. It sat on her face like armor, well-maintained and deliberate. She looked at Visenya when they entered. Visenya looked back. Something moved across Claire's face in the space between one breath and the next. Recognition, adjustment, the rapid internal recalibration of a woman processing the fact that the girl she'd slapped and belittled and made to scrub floors was standing in her hall wearing a mating mark. And the quiet, unsettled authority of someone with power. She recovered quickly. Visenya gave her credit for that. "Thank you for coming," Claire said. Her voice was steady, almost. "Where is Alpha Elliot?" Vector said. Not a greeting, simply the question, delivered in the tone of a man who has limited time and has decided not to spend any of it on preamble. Claire's composure flickered. Just briefly. His condition has worsened considerably overnight, she said. He is not able to receive visitors today, perhaps tomorrow if he is rested. Visenya said nothing. She sat in the chair Vector had indicated with a small movement of his hand and folded her own hands on the table and watched Claire's face with the open, unhurried attention that notices everything and reveals nothing. That is very unfortunate, Visenya said. Her voice was gentle. We hope for his recovery. Claire looked at her. The look lasted a beat too long. Yes, she said, as do we all. The meeting continued. There were matters of the alliance to discuss, the treaty terms, the obligations each pack carried, the formal acknowledgement of Helian's position, now that Visenya had transferred her allegiance through the mating bond. Claire handled it competently. She was not a stupid woman. She'd never been a stupid woman, which had made her cruelties more deliberate and therefore more difficult to excuse. Vector handled the treaty conversation with his usual precision, and Visenya contributed where she was needed and said nothing where she wasn't. When the meeting ended and they stood to leave, Claire looked at Visenya one last time. There was something in the look that was not hostility and not warmth, something complicated. Visenya met the look evenly and then looked away, and they walked out of the hall into the gray mid-morning corridor, and she did not look back. The afternoon was quiet. They ate in their room. Vector worked through documents he'd brought from Helion, and Visenya read, or appeared to read, sitting in the chair by the window with a book open in her lap and her eyes moving across the pages at the pace of someone who is reading every word carefully. She was not reading. She had not absorbed a single sentence in 3 hours. She was thinking about timing. The thing she'd carried for years, the thing she'd been building in the only way available to her, slowly, invisibly, in the margins of a life that had been arranged to give her no power whatsoever, was nearly at its end. She'd started it before she'd known she'd started it, back when she was still in Ashwood, still scrubbing floors. She'd heard a great deal over the years, about herbs and compounds and the things that moved through a body quietly, over time, so gradually that no one thought to look for them until the looking was too late. She'd known. She'd always known. She'd been adding small amounts to Elliot's food for 3 years before Vector ever walked into that auction hall. Not enough to kill. Not then, not quickly, because quick would have raised questions she couldn't answer and consequences she couldn't survive. Just enough to begin a process. Slow and patient and invisible, the way she'd learned to do everything that mattered. The poison moved through him like time, like age, like the accumulated weight of a body being asked to carry something it couldn't name. His healers had looked and found nothing because they weren't looking for the right thing. His pack had watched him decline and called it illness, called it stress, called it the burden of leadership wearing on a man, because the body tells a story and people read the story they expect rather than the one being written. She had been very patient, but patience has a shape. It is not infinite, and she'd been carrying this for years now, feeding it carefully, and tonight, she was going to finish it. She turned a page she hadn't read and looked out the window at the darkening sky and did not feel the things she'd expected to feel. She'd expected guilt. Real guilt. Was the kind that arrived with a body and a weight, and the particular nausea of a conscience making itself heard. She'd prepared for it, had spent years building arguments to hold against it, justifications she could deploy when it came. What she felt instead was quieter. Sadder. The feeling of a thing that had to be done being done, without joy in the doing, without hatred animating the hand. She did not hate Elliot. She had hated him once, in the early years, with the hot, furious hatred of a child who cannot understand how someone could do what he'd done and continue to exist in the world without consequence. But hatred like that doesn't last. It burns through itself eventually, and what's left is colder and cleaner and far more dangerous. She did not hate him. She simply would not let him live. Those were different things. She knew the difference mattered, even if no one else ever would. Vector looked up from his documents across the room. His eyes found her at the window. She was looking at the sky, and he was looking at her. And after a moment she felt his gaze and turned to meet it. His face was still. He said nothing. She said nothing. The fire between them was low and warm, and the room was very quiet, and she looked at him for a long moment. This man who had knelt in the grass for a little girl, who had held her in the dark by her parents' graves without asking a single question. And she memorized his face the way she memorized things that mattered. Then she went back to her book. She waited until the house was fully asleep. Not just quiet, fully, deeply asleep. The kind of sleep a house falls into past midnight when the fires have burned low and the last footsteps have faded and the whole structure settles into the particular silence of a building that has stopped holding itself up for the day. Vector was warm behind her, his arm around her waist, his breathing slow and deep and even. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe and pressed the back of his hand to her lips very gently and felt the warmth of his skin and the solid reality of him and let that be the last thing she felt before she moved. She rose slowly. She was better at this now than she'd been the night before, knew the specific pressure of his arm, knew the exact angle of release, knew how to redistribute his weight without disturbing the rhythm of his sleep. She stood and dressed in the dark, her fingers finding the familiar shapes of her clothing without light. She took the vial from the inner pocket of her cloak where it had lived, carefully wrapped in cloth for the entire journey. Small, no larger than her thumb. The glass was dark and the liquid inside was darker, and it had no smell because that was the point. It had never had a smell, had never announced itself, had simply been present in his body for years doing the quiet, thorough work she'd asked of it. She held it for a moment in the dark. Then she put it in her pocket and went to the door. The corridor was empty. The torches had burned to half their length, throwing a low amber light that barely reached the floor. Her feet were silent on the stone, and then silent on the carpet, and then silent on the stone again as she turned toward the east wing where the Alpha's private chambers were. The guards outside Elliot's door looked at her when she arrived. She met their eyes with the unhurried calm of a woman who goes where she is permitted to go, who has always gone where she is permitted to go. She was the mated queen of the most powerful pack in the North. The alliance that kept this pack breathing bore her name on its documents now alongside her mates. They stood aside. She had expected to need a reason. She had prepared 3. She didn't need any of them. She pushed the door open and stepped inside and pulled it closed behind her. The room smelled of illness. That was the first thing. The thick, medicinal smell of a sick room, herbs burned to mask other smells, the particular heaviness of air that hasn't moved freely in too long, something underneath it all that was organic and faintly sweet in a way that healthy rooms are not. The fire was banked low. One candle burned on the table beside the bed. Elliot was in the bed. She had thought she was prepared for what she would find. She had been wrong about that. He was very thin. The handsomeness that had always been his primary weapon, the practiced, polished good looks of a man who'd understood from early on how much easier the world becomes when it finds your face pleasing, had not entirely left him, but it sat differently now. Loosely. The way a fine coat sits on a frame that has lost the weight to fill it. His skin had gone the color of old candle wax, pale and slightly yellowed, and his hands on the blanket were still, his chest rising and falling with the shallow, effortful quality of breathing that has become work. His eyes were open. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She'd assumed sleep, had been counting on the specific mercy of delivering what she'd come to deliver to someone who didn't know she was there. But his eyes were open, and they found her the moment she moved into the candlelight. And they were clear. Whatever the illness had taken from him, it had not taken his mind, and he knew who she was. She sat down in the chair beside his bed. She sat the way she'd learned to sit in 17 years of occupying spaces without permission, quietly, taking up only what was needed, making nothing of herself that could be used against her. Except it wasn't that anymore. She wasn't sitting small. She was simply sitting, with her hands in her lap and the vial in her pocket, and the candle between them throwing its small, warm light. He looked at her. He tried to speak. His mouth moved and a sound came out that was not quite a word. The paralysis had taken his voice along with his body, she understood, leaving only the eyes and the shallow breathing and whatever was happening inside the mind that couldn't reach the surface. She watched him try. She let him try. Then she spoke. Quietly, the way she'd spoken to her parents' graves. Not performing, just saying the true thing. "You killed them on a Tuesday," she said. "I remember because my mother had made bread that morning. The whole house smelled of it when they came. I have never been able to smell fresh bread since without thinking of that morning. That is one of the things you took from me." His eyes moved. He couldn't turn his head, but his eyes tracked her, wide and present and afraid in a way that his face had never been permitted to be when he'd had the use of it. "You wanted my mother," she said. "She didn't want you. That's the whole story, isn't it? Every complicated piece of it, all the way back to the beginning. A woman who didn't want you. And you were a man who had decided that what he wanted he was simply owed." She looked at his hands on the blanket. They were still. They would never not be still now. "I was 7 years old," she said. 7. And I knew. I knew it was you, I knew why, I knew all of it. And I couldn't say a word to anyone because the word would have gotten me killed too. So I kept it. For 17 years, I kept it. And I kept other things too. She reached into her pocket. She took out the vial and held it up in the candlelight so he could see it clearly. The dark glass, the darker liquid inside. His eyes went to it. She watched the moment he understood. Not the vial. He'd already understood the vial, she could see that. The moment he understood the years of it, the length of it, the patience of it, the realization moving across his face that what he was looking at was not something recent, not something decided in Helion or in the aftermath of the auction, but something old. Something she'd been doing from inside his own walls, under his own roof, for years, while she scrubbed his floors and kept her head down and let him believe she was nothing. The fear in his eyes became something else, something larger. She held his gaze. "You spent 17 years believing I was nothing," she said. "I want you to know, in the time you have left, that I was paying attention the entire time. I was always paying attention, and I am my mother's daughter, and she was worth 10 of you, and she always will be." She uncorked the vial. She did it without hurry, without theater. She leaned forward and she tipped the contents carefully past his lips, and his eyes thrashed, wide and urgent and trapped, all the things he'd never permitted himself to show when he had the choice. But he could not move, and she held his nose gently until she felt the swallow, and then she sat back. She set the empty vial on her knee. She watched his eyes. There was no drama in what followed. She had not expected drama. She had known it would be quiet, had known it would look to any witness, simply like what the illness had already been doing. The body slowing, the breathing narrowing, the particular stillness of a person going somewhere that cannot be followed. His eyes stayed on hers for a long time. Long enough that she began to wonder what he was seeing in her face, what he was reading in it, whether there was anything left in him capable of something like understanding. She did not look away. She owed him nothing. She owed him less than nothing. But she understood, in some part of herself, that had nothing to do with what he deserved, that looking away was something she would carry. So she looked at him. She sat with him in the candlelight, and she looked at him until there was nothing left to look at. His eyes closed. His chest rose once more, slow and shallow. And then it didn't rise again. The candle flickered in a draft from somewhere. The room was very still. Visenya sat in the chair for a long moment. She was not crying. She had thought she might cry, had thought the enormity of it might produce something that looked like grief. even if it wasn't grief exactly, even if it was something more complicated and harder to name. But what she felt was simpler than that, and heavier. Done. That was the word. That was the only word. Not relief, not yet, maybe not ever entirely, but the plain, quiet, final fact of a thing completed. A thing she'd carried for 17 years, through every floor she'd scrubbed and every blow she'd absorbed and every night she'd cried in the dark and every morning she'd gotten up and started again, was finished. She stood from the chair. She straightened her dress. She looked at Elliot's face one final time, still now, in the specific stillness that is different from sleep, that has a quality to it that every living thing recognizes instinctively. And she said, very quietly, the last thing she would ever say to him. "Rest," she said. Not warmly, not cruelly, simply, the way you say a word when it is the only true one available. She put the empty vial back in her pocket. She crossed the room and opened the door and stepped past the guards without looking at them and walked back down the corridor the way she'd come, and the torches burned their low amber on either side of her, and her feet were silent on the stone. Their room was exactly as she'd left it. The fire had burned lower while she was gone, throwing only a dim red glow across the floor. The room smelled of wood smoke and him, that clean, cold, familiar scent that her body had long since decided meant safety. He was in the same position she'd left him, one arm stretched across the bed in the unconscious reaching of sleep, his face relaxed in the way it rarely was when he was awake, younger-looking, quieter. She took off her cloak. She set it over the chair. She reached into the pocket and took the empty vial out and set it on the windowsill behind the curtain where it would not be found, and she would dispose of it properly when they left. Then she went to the bed. She slid in carefully, slowly, the way she'd been doing for months, making herself small in the movement. Oh, not wanting to disturb him, not wanting to have to talk yet, not ready for words or explanations or even the intimacy of being seen right now. His arm found her before she'd finished settling. Not with the slow, searching movement of someone waking from deep sleep, with the immediate, certain movement of someone who had not been asleep at all. His arm coming around her waist and drawing her in, his body curling around hers from behind, his face pressing into her hair. Warm, solid, entirely real. She closed her eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He simply held her, the way he'd held her in the forest by her parents' graves, not trying to fix the shape of the night, not trying to understand it, not requiring anything from her except that she let herself be held. Tears came. Quietly, without sobs, without the shaking of the night before, just tears moving sideways across her face into the pillow. The cry came at dawn, a single voice first, high and sharp, the sound of someone who has walked into a room expecting to find a sleeping man and has found something else entirely. Then a second voice, and a third, and the particular quality of sound that travels through a building when something terrible has been discovered, moving from room to room like water finding its level, filling every corridor and stairwell and quiet corner until the whole structure was vibrating with it. Visenya was already awake when it began. She lay still and listened to it build. She felt Vector wake behind her, the quick, a complete alertness of a man whose body had been trained to surface from sleep ready, and felt him still when he registered what he was hearing. She sat up. She smoothed her hair. She reached for the glass of water on the bedside table and drank from it in the methodical way of someone preparing for the next thing. Vector was watching her. She looked at him over the rim of the glass. He was sitting up in the bed with his hair loose and his eyes on her face, fully awake, fully present, reading her with the attention of a man who has had months to learn the specific vocabulary of her expressions. She set the glass down. She looked at him, and she let him see her face. Not the managed version, not the neutral, composed pretense. She let him see the whole of it. Everything. And she held his gaze steadily and let the silence say the thing that words would have made smaller. He looked back at her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached across the bed and took her hand. Both of hers in both of his. He looked down at her hands and then up at her face, and his green eyes were not asking her anything. Not building a case, not calculating consequences. They were simply there, specific and steady and entirely hers, the eyes of a man who has decided that understanding comes after, that the only thing required of this moment is presence. He lifted her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Gently, without drama. She felt the tears again and let two of them fall and then pressed them away with the back of her wrist and straightened. "We should dress," she said. "They'll come to us soon." "Yes," he said. Nothing else, just yes. They dressed. They were ready when the knock came. The pack was in chaos in the way that packs go into chaos when their alpha is suddenly gone. Not the organized, directed chaos of war or disaster where there is a clear threat and therefore a clear response, but the formless, frightened chaos of a people whose center has collapsed and who don't yet know what holds them up without it. They moved through it like two people walking through weather. The corridor was full of servants and warriors and advisors, people moving quickly in multiple directions, voices overlapping, someone weeping somewhere close, someone issuing instructions further away. Faces turned toward Vector when they saw him, the instinctive turning of people toward the nearest available source of order. And he moved through the corridor with the quiet, grounding authority that had nothing performed in it, and the chaos around them seemed to settle by small degrees in the wake of his passing. Visenya walked beside him. She looked at the faces as they passed, frightened faces, confused faces, a few that were simply blank with shock. She looked for guilt among them and found only grief, and filed that away too. They found Claire in the main hall. She was standing very still in the center of the room in the particular posture of a woman who has received a blow and is deciding whether or not to fall. Her face was white. Her eyes were red. Whatever she'd felt about Elliot, the complicated, strained, often cruel architecture of a mating bond built on a foundation that was never quite right, she was feeling the absence of him now in the specific way that absence is felt when it is final and there is no possibility of revision. Visenya looked at her and felt the complicated thing she'd been carrying about Claire. Not sympathy exactly, not forgiveness, but the recognition that cruelty is often the primary language of people who are themselves in pain, and that this does not excuse it but does explain it, and that explanation and excuse are not the same thing. She walked to Claire and stopped in front of her. Claire looked at her. In those red, exhausted eyes was a question that would never be asked, that could never be asked, that both of them knew would never receive an answer. Visenya held her gaze with the steady, open calm of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. She reached out and covered Claire's hand with hers, briefly, barely a moment, and said simply, "I'm sorry for your loss." She meant it. Not for Elliot. She would not perform a grief she didn't have, but for the loss itself, for the particular hollowness of finding yourself on the other side of something permanent with nothing to hold but the questions that can't be answered. She knew that feeling. Claire looked at her hand over hers. She looked at the mating mark on Visenya's wrist. Something moved across her face that was too tired to be readable. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. The quietest thing Visenya had ever heard her say. They stayed for 3 days. It was required, the protocols of alliance and respect, and the maintenance of the political relationships that kept packs from the kind of conflict that cost lives. And they stayed through all of it. The formal acknowledgement of Elliot's passing, the arrangements, the conversations with the pack's senior council about succession and stability, and the ongoing terms of the Helion alliance. Visenya sat through all of it. She was useful in all of it, asking the precise questions, noting the particular hesitations, smoothing the friction points with the same quiet competence that had surprised people at Helion and had stopped surprising them because it was simply what she did. She did not go back to the East Wing. While on the morning of the fourth day, they loaded their carriage and said their formal goodbyes, and the pack gathered to see them off with the collective, exhausted air of people who are glad to have something resolved even when the resolution is painful. Visenya stood on the steps and looked out at the Ashwood grounds for the last time. The great oak in the east courtyard, the kitchen window with its permanent amber light, the corridor that led to the small room she'd lived in for 17 years, which would now be given to someone else, who would sleep in it without knowing what the walls had witnessed. She looked at all of it. She said goodbye to none of it. It didn't need her goodbye. It had taken enough from her already. The journey back to Helion took 2 days. She slept for most of the first one. Properly, deeply, the sleep of a body that has finally been permitted to put something down, heavy and complete, with no dreams she could remember, just the long dark of genuine rest. She woke with her head on Vector's shoulder and his hand moving slowly in her hair and the forest moving past the carriage window in the warm, late-afternoon gold of a day that had gone on without her while she slept. And she lay still for a while and breathed in the smell of him and looked at the forest going gold outside the window and let the warm strangeness of that settle over her. "You were asleep for 4 hours," Vector said above her. His voice had the low, unhurried quality it had in the mornings. "I know," she said. "You snored." She lifted her head and looked at him. He was looking out the window with the expression he wore when he was saying something true while appearing to say something casual, the corners of his mouth doing the barely there thing. "I absolutely did not," she said. "Quite thoroughly," he said. "I considered waking you and decided against it. You seemed committed to it." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she put her head back on his shoulder, and he made the sound that was his version of a laugh, and she closed her eyes again and felt the smile on her face, and did not try to manage it into something smaller. Home. She's home.